Welcome to the Green Issues Forum. This is a series that takes place once every 2 months and deals with some topic of local interest. Tonight we're going to be talking about the missing middle, which is a proposal by the city administration to increase density in the city. And with us tonight are Judy Barden, who is an environmental epidemiologist and was on the Planning Commission when they were working on the comprehensive plan, and Jim Keogh, who is in the East Side Neighborhood Association and has been working on sub-area planning. Both of them are very knowledgeable about this proposal and have a lot to say. Judy will be introducing the program because she's very familiar with the details.
So the proposal the concept comes out of California from an architect there, and it started about 8 years ago. And the idea is that in the past few decades, we've been doing a lot of apartments and single-family detached houses, but there hasn't been that much in between. And so we're missing these kind of units, these in-between units that go between apartments and single-family homes. It's a little bit of a misnomer in Olympia because there's 10 housing types covered by the missing middle, and 5 of them are already allowed in our single-family neighborhood. This proposal is really to increase density in the single-family neighborhoods. So it's a complex proposal. There are 43 separate provisions, and then 5 of the units are already allowed, and those are tiny houses, accessory dwelling units, or what people call ADUs, manufactured homes, so those are sort of prefabricated homes. And then there's also cottage housing, which is housing that has a shared common outdoor area with parking. And then the other one are townhouses. We currently allow 4 townhouses in a row. So the proposal ushers in 5 new types of housing, and that would be duplex, would be expanded to a wider area. We also have, and those are 2 units in a building. We also have triplexes, 3 units in a building, fourplexes, 4 units in a building. Single room occupancies, which are called boarding house. And then the 4th type is courtyard apartments. So that's up to 12 apartment units at a time. So that's the missing middle.
Right, and proponents have a lot of hopes for this. They hope that possibility of sharing your home with someone from outside of your family would help with the demographics, which are changing. Now, instead of having quite so many families, we have more single people and couples living alone in a big house. And they hope that allowing these people to share their homes would increase the density. They hope to take the pressure off of urban sprawl. We have an urban growth area, and they see a lot of pressure for building to go on towards the outskirts of the urban growth area, or even in the unincorporated area. And they'd like to take some of that pressure off. A proponent says she fully expects some backlash from neighborhood groups worried about change. But she says, growth is happening. You can either get out in front of it with a vision for incorporating people in a way that's healthy, or you can try to resist it and watch it sprawl out to the urban growth boundaries. There are a lot of people who simply like density in a village or in a city. They'd like Olympia to become more of a city. Density can be more efficient as far as provision of utilities, pipelines providing electricity, water, sewage, are more efficient if the units are closer together. Density can be an incentive for more retail areas, small nodes for commercial activity, things that are convenient for people. All of these things they hope will happen if missing middle options are more available, more allowed. So one of the reasons for making the proposal now is that they see a lot of growth taking place in the next 20 years. I think they mentioned 20,000 people coming in, and they'd like to have something in place for that. Do you think this is a reasonable way of addressing this expected influx of population?
For me personally, no. I mean, the proposal comes out without much scoping and really no defined goals. It kind of conflicts with over 20 policies in our comprehensive plan. We've already planned for development in 3 high-density nodes. And in fact, in downtown, which is one of our nodes, we have 3 nodes. One is the Martin Pacific Lilly Triangle, and then by Capitol Mall and downtown. A quarter of our growth was supposed to go downtown. We're already on track in just a couple years to put in a third of the 5,000 units that were supposed to go downtown. I think we have 800 units going in, which will make housing for about 13 or 1,400 people. So I think we should be developing the nodes and following our comprehensive plan. Also, in terms of, we have enough buildable land, according to our buildable land report, to last us through 2035. They do this inventory, and it was done last in 2014, and it goes through 2035. So according to our buildable lands report, there's enough land. In terms of preserving farmland and forest, all development in our urban growth area will accomplish that. In fact, apartment buildings, denser developments do a better job. And also the comprehensive plan envisions really distinct areas so that we would have single-family neighborhoods and these nodes, and then areas that were medium density. So we're trying to make everything pretty homogeneous.
Yeah, another big need that planners see in Olympia is the need for affordable housing. And originally they thought that this missing middle proposal would help with the affordable housing situation. Even if it didn't provide affordable housing in the new housing types, I think the hope was that instead of so many middle-income people chasing what housing there is and possibly raising the prices through their pressure that they're exerting, they would ease off because there would be enough housing for them. Do you have anything to say about this thought?
I think that unfortunately the missing middle has been a little bit oversold in that regard. When you look at the city's projections for how many housing units are expected to be developed over the next 20 years under this proposal, the hard estimate is roughly 1,000 units over that 20-year period, so about 50, just a little short of 50 a year. And they double that to incorporate the potential for accessory dwelling units and some redevelopment of existing houses. But even at that point, you're only talking about 100 houses a year. And 100 houses a year in the city of Olympia represents a very, very small percentage, not even a percentage, of the amount of housing that needs to be developed. So the end result is that you're not going to get in terms of market rate or decrease, how much you're going to essentially provide enough housing to reduce rents. You're just not going to get enough movement in that regard.
And the housing itself, the duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes, courtyard apartments, they're not going to be on the affordable side of the scale, are they?
So far, nothing has indicated that. Studies that have been done in other cities, for instance, the city of Portland took a look at the cost of accessory dwelling units, and they did a study in 2013, and they found that those units were not cheaper than existing housing units for the people there. The only way that became cheaper is if instead of developing accessory dwelling units at the 800 square foot level, you developed them at the 400 square foot level. So you had to basically make smaller housing, much smaller housing, in order to lower the cost at all.
And we're actually increasing the size of our accessory dwelling units. They're allowed to go to 800 square
And the
feet.
cottage units are the same way.
I mean, if you look at current housing prices, it costs about $200 to $300 dollars per square foot. So these units are not cheap to build. And also there's hookup fees, there's the cost of foundations.
Yeah.
You know.
And just the basic hard costs of getting sewer in and the electrical, et cetera. So.
Right, and people are very excited listening to public comment, which I have done, about tiny houses and ADUs, and they're already required by state law. So people think that we're ushering in these ADUs where we're changing provisions for the ADUs, but they're already allowed. And the proposal does very little for tiny houses. They're thinking that maybe they could permit a tiny home park, but basically if a tiny home is on a trailer, it's considered a recreational vehicle and you can only park it in one place for 6 months. So you could put a tiny house on a foundation, but as soon as you start making it a regular house, it becomes more expensive. And again, you have the hookup fees and the impact fees, and you have to, hook up to sewer. It's not an inexpensive unit.
No, in fact, the prices that I've seen for tiny houses are very comparable to the prices of getting somebody to build an accessory dwelling unit on your property in the first place. Very, very close in pricing.
And I think this Portland study that Jim referenced found that actually that ADUs rented at a premium of about, in Portland, $250 more a month over an apartment, so that they did not come in cheaper. The only way they were cheaper was if somebody built them and rent them out to a family or a friend. That those units somebody sort of was on purpose giving that unit at a less of a price to someone.
Yeah, well, another benefit that the proponents are talking about is more choice for renters, but it doesn't seem that choice is going to translate into lower prices or anything. It's just more choice in itself. Plus, not enough units in addition to what's already there to make it a very significant expansion of our choice.
Well, we have 5 units that are already allowed, and what's new are the duplexes in certain areas of town, triplexes and fourplexes, which are really, and courtyard apartments. Those are really pretty impactful type of units in a single family neighborhood. Single room occupancies are the one housing choice that seems like they might be affordable, the rooming house model. But according to the proposal, there needs to be, I think, more safeguards put in there, like specifying a bathroom per so many residents, or a certain amount of square footage that each person could have, so that we don't get these tiny chopped up units, some protection. Having a full kitchen, because the SROs will have a shared bathrooms and shared kitchen facilities. So those might be more affordable.
Well, as long as we're talking about all these different kinds, I thought I'd pass along some pictures and maybe you'd have comments on them. Here's a picture of courtyard housing. I think it's maybe a little more expansive than what builders would have room for in Olympia.
Right, and it looks really nice because it's brick, but I don't think of that many people building with brick nowadays.
Here's a house which has obviously been subdivided, turned into a boarding house. I guess a modern day boarding house wouldn't look so obvious.
Right, and
This
that's again a beautiful historic house.
Yes.
There's lots of those in Tacoma, not so many in Olympia.
This is a representative of upper-end housing. This is what's probably not going to be turned into a duplex.
Right, and that's one of the things about the missing middle is we kind of fear that it won't be evenly distributed because neighborhoods that have covenants will be somewhat protected. Then new neighborhoods with new or expensive housing, those won't be impacted. We're afraid that, you know, more modest homes on larger lots will be torn down to make room for a triplex or a fourplex to get the land.
Right.
And so a house like that you just showed us, there's no way that somebody's going to try to demolish that.
Yeah.
No, in fact, the study that the city had done, looking at teardown likelihoods, focused on houses that averaged in cost, not counting the land, at around $75,000.
Okay, and I have a picture of some houses in that range.
Right, right.
So we're expecting that this is the kind of house that will be sacrificed for denser housing.
Right, and right now there's currently over on 4th and Central, it's happening in our urban density corridor, which, you know, is slated for a higher density. But we have 3 houses, older homes, I would say.
All pre-World War II.
Yeah, that are being torn down to make room for a 50-unit apartment building. So this can happen, and I think one of them cost $500,000.
Yeah, the proposal for it's a mixture of apartments and condominiums, and the proposal is for high-end condominiums.
But these were not necessarily cheap housing, and yet we see right away that we're having some homes demolished to make room for denser units. So this is a reality. This really could happen.
Okay. Here's an accessory dwelling unit in someone's backyard.
Right.
That's kind of as
That's
expected.
That looks like 800 square foot.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty big one.
Yeah.
And here's a tiny house,
Right.
looking very cute.
Very cute. But again, you have to pay for the foundation and the
Yes,
sewer, but it's a cute house.
So here's another thing that we haven't talked about. What happens to the price of the existing housing around one of the sites of a new housing type that's gone in? Maybe a low-end house has been demolished and a quadruplex has been put in. What happens to the prices of the rest of the housing on that street? Because, of course, proponents are hoping that as more housing comes on the market, prices go down. Is that what we expect?
Do you want me to tackle
Yeah,
this
why
first?
don't you go
And
first?
I'll let Jim chime in because he's done a lot of analysis in his neighborhood. So basically, you know, market forces, and when you have demand for housing. So we haven't had a lot of housing built for a while because we were in a recession. So people were living with parents or they were doubling up in housing and sort of making do. So now there's increased demand for housing. So when there's demand for housing, developers say, oh, people want housing, we have a low vacancy rate, it's profitable to build, they can get a good return on their investment, and they build housing. At the point that the vacancy rate increases and it's not as profitable to build, they stop building new housing. There's a bit of a lag with that until the people figure out that the vacancy rate has increased. But housing that's built in our neighborhoods wouldn't be built somewhere else, like in the nodes. There's only a sort of finite amount of housing that will be built.
Okay. Well, how about the
By
fact
by the bigger investors, that is.
How about the fact that this block suddenly has an expensive building in it, whereas before it had only had low-end housing. Does that have any effect on, well, for instance, would it have an effect on the assessment of the houses, the rest of the houses on the block, or the rents that they could be asking for if they happen to rent out rooms?
That's a hard balance to figure out, because on the one hand, you might get assessed more in taxes because you can put more units or more building on there, so the land value may rise. On the other hand, depending on how the landlord takes care of that property, if they keep it up really well, usually isn't horrible for the neighborhood. If they don't keep it up, or if you have a lot of impact on the neighborhood, for instance, if all of a sudden you've got lots of extra cars parked in the area, then it drives down the price, especially for the people nearest by. So it can sometimes be kind of a mixed bag through the neighborhood in that regard, and it's a little bit hard to project exactly how that plays. I think generally speaking, it's thought that if you have a rental property that's not being taken sufficiently good care of, it'll drive down the prices in a little circle around that particular property. If it's very well taken care of, it doesn't do that. And that becomes part of the gamble in this. What does happen a lot of times is that we saw this some in the east side right about the time I moved into that area couple decades ago, which was that at that time we were having an awful lot of duplexes and triplexes built in the neighborhood. And then the city came in and capped that off a little bit because there were so many going in. And what was happening is that we ended up having a lot of speculation going on in the neighborhood. So people were buying up the houses, speculators, and then sitting on them and letting them decline, waiting to develop into the duplexes and triplexes they thought they were going to get to. The neighborhood's values actually climbed when they capped out that duplex development and essentially said no more, because everybody said, oh, well then basically what happened is the speculators sold out and other people bought the houses and fixed them up.
Right. And also, it's one thing to build a single family house, but these larger units, such as a triplex or a fourplex or a courtyard apartment, the only people who can really afford to buy those type of units are big developers and investors, not your small, person who wants to build their own house, or
Right, I
a
can't
small
imagine.
investor, somebody who might buy a house to rent out and live locally. So you start opening up especially when you get tear downs for these bigger units, you start opening it up to outside investment interests, and the whole dynamic changes.
Yes.
And didn't
So-
you say that about 54 in your neighborhood? It's 54%. It's 50 even renter.
We're almost dead even in the east side. In fact, right now the renters slightly outnumber the homeowners in the east side. So we're roughly at 50-50. We're also one of the densest neighborhoods in the city. We're at a little bit over 6 units per developed residential acre. So that's kind of what our neighborhood looks like. We laughingly say that we're the missing middle neighborhood already, because we already have lots of duplexes and lots of triplexes, and we have apartments, both small and large. We even have some cottages in the neighborhood, as well as a fair amount of single-family homes, mostly small. Over 50% of our houses in the east side are under 1,500 square feet, which makes us a very affordable neighborhood for a lot of people.
Is that what you call an R6 to 12 neighborhood?
We're an R4 to 8, except for one band that's R6 to 12.
I see.
So we're about R4 to 8 for, I'd say, about 80% of the neighborhood, and about R6 to 12 for the remaining
And
20.
4 to 8 would mean that you have to have at least 4 units per acre, but you can't
Correct.
have more than 8. So there's room for some play even in that definition.
Yes, and like I said, the east side right now is developed at about 6 units an acre overall
Okay.
on average, so that's what we've been going at.
So
in the 4 to 8 section.
This proposal is targeted towards what's defined as low-density neighborhoods. So that's 4 to 8 units per acre, or 6 to 12 units per acre. Those are the two zoning.
Now, I had a question here I was going to ask. who benefits from the development into one of these missing middle units. And I think you've said that it's not going to be the homeowner because the homeowner isn't ambitious enough usually to plan a big unit like a quadruplex and get the loan out and negotiate all of the fees and permits.
Right. In fact, the Portland study said that one of the main barriers to people, the two big barriers to people developing a simple unit like an ADU would be first understanding the zoning and the construction regulations. Mm-hmm. And the second one was getting the financing. That for a single family homeowner who wanted to build an ADU in their backyard, getting the financing to build that unit was a major thing, you know. And you know, then they would need to rent it out at a price to pay off the loan. So if it's hard to build an ADU, you can imagine a normal property owner isn't going to build a courtyard apartment or a fourplex.
And in fact, they don't usually sell directly to the builders either, do they? They would sell to a broker if they were going to sell, and then the builder would find the property he wanted in the broker's offerings. Is that right?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. We haven't developed an EDU or I think the simple answer to all of this is that if you're going to do an ADU, you have to probably have paid down your house a fair ways so that you have some equity in the house to do so. And when you get into the larger developments, whether it's, I would say that most of the time we see developments that occur in those cases, the larger ones are people who've got money and means who've been steadily picking up properties over time and have finally collapsed them together. Or they happen to pick up a piece of property that's fairly large. But in that case, it's a fair amount of money still to go through the development process.
Okay, and all of it is going to be kind of irrelevant to the low-income person who's looking for an affordable place to live.
Right. I mean, generally speaking, unless the city has some incentive for doing something different, they're going to develop market rate housing. Right.
And I think we heard in the Planning Commission, the meetings we were attending, that building a duplex costs something like $550,000. So these are not, that's just 2 units. These are not cheap things to build. You know, that's a lot of money for your average, you know, investor.
Okay. Where will all this new density take place? Do you have, you said it was within 2 blocks of the bus line. Do you have a picture that you could show us?
Well, there's this picture here. So the density is going to take place, first of all, duplexes are allowed throughout Olympia. So that's all over. And then it's in all areas. Here, the yellow are your 6 to 12 zoned areas. So those areas are going to be able to have triplexes, fourplexes, and courtyard apartments. And then the pink areas, all those are the bus routes throughout Olympia. And within 600 feet, which is 2 blocks on either side, you're going to be able to build the triplexes, fourplexes, and courtyard apartments. So you can see it takes in a really, I would say it's about 30% of Olympia is being, the zoning is being changed.
Okay, and the areas?
Well, it's actually 100% if you take in the duplexes, because duplexes are now, before they were only allowed in the yellow area, now they're going to be throughout.
Okay, and the residential areas that are only going to be allowed to have those duplexes, they are looking more like islands, aren't they?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
The islands you're looking at are the ones that can't have fourplexes and triplexes.
Right.
And courtyard apartments, so that grouping.
But the thing with the bus routes is the city doesn't have any control over the bus routes. That's inner city transit. So the bus routes can change. And in fact, we have 3 bus routes that are changing. If you go to inner city transit site, you can see the new bus routes so the bus routes will shift, and then they could put density near those new bus routes.
So you would double the amount of area that could take more density.
Right, and also Jim's point, he's looked in his neighborhood, a lot of the buses, you can maybe speak to that.
What I would say is that not all bus lines are created equal. So you have buses going down South Capitol Way, Harrison, the 4th and State Corridor, once every 10, most 15 minutes during the typical daylight hours. Some of the bus lines that are being affected and essentially opening the door for new development under these proposals run only about once every 40 minutes or every 45 minutes. The one that goes up Bigelow into the northeast neighborhood only goes around in a circle in the neighborhood and goes back downtown again. So you don't get to a grocery store, you don't get to a medical facility, and you're not, in most cases, going to a major employer unless you transfer. So for those people, one of the justifications for using the bus lines has been that it potentially makes housing more affordable because you don't need to use a car. Not having a car saves you a couple $100 a month, ergo that's money you can apply to housing. But unfortunately, if you can't use the car to get to a grocery store, to an employer, to a medical facility, or you can't get there unless you're willing to wait for very long periods of time, in which case it interferes with having a job and those types of things, then it doesn't really supplant, and people end up having cars anyway. Mm-hmm. And so it gets you into a double whammy. I mean, the bus lines are supposedly the justification, but they don't really justify this on an affordability basis. They don't really reduce the transportation need. And ultimately, just to kind of prove that to a large extent, Portland also in their study about accessory dwelling units, and of course Portland has a much better transit system than we do and is much more dense, still found that a typical accessory dwelling unit had 1 car per accessory dwelling unit, which it goes back to why the city of Olympia, before the missing middle, had always required that you have an off-street parking slot for that car.
Right. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the bus routes, we lack sidewalks.
Right.
So, walking to that bus route may not be the safe. And we have concerns about the ADUs the provisions are changing, so now the owner doesn't have to be on site. They can be 2 stories high, 24 feet. They can be 800 feet in square feet. And then the other thing is they're taking away the parking requirement.
Well, they're doing one more than that. If you convert a garage, you also get to put your car on the street too. So you get to put 2 cars on the street for every ADU.
Yeah.
So
I think that's okay. Well, not that that's okay. I think that's too much. Basically, you've just filled the entire front lot frontage of your house right immediately, or you've moved it to your neighbors. But the additional problem you have in that is that it's a much more liberal provision than we make for duplexes, where they require to have the parking off the street. So if you were, by opening up the door to investors, in this case, to buy and develop ADUs, you've basically given them a double provision. You've given them something they would rather do than make a duplex. And they're going to pay for extra for that, which will drive up housing costs for those properties that they can get away with doing that on. Mm-hmm. So it's a tumble. I mean, it's kind of like they've given too many goodies in this set of provisions to try to encourage accessory dwelling units.
Yeah. We have so many moving parts with this proposal. We're changing provisions for 5 existing missing middle types that we already have, and then we have 5 new types, and there's so many missing intricate parts with this 43 provisions that it's really hard to evaluate how they're all going to play out.
And speaking of moving parts, you had started to talk about the fact that the bus route changes now and then.
Right. IT can, I think the city has 1 seat on inner city transit, and they're the one that determine the bus routes. And they just were before the Planning Commission, I think 2 meetings ago, and said that there are 3 changes to the bus routes. And It's hard to predict how many more changes there'll be, but they evaluate, I think they evaluate where the routes are needed. There's a finite amount of money in terms of how much we have for transportation, and so then they put the bus routes, as I understand it, in the places where there's the most need.
So after we determine the areas based on the bus routes where we can put in denser housing, and then the bus route changes, what happens? Do we just add another area?
It's either that or the city has talked about trying to go ahead and just put in code the streets that the buses are currently on. But of course, if you separate the bus routes from the actual where you're going to then have missing middle housing developed, and you were justifying putting the housing where the bus routes were, you've kind of broken the link in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Right. When I was at the Planning Commission, they said yes, basically, that you could then have density in the new bus route. And bus routes are really, they're the infrastructure that's easiest to change. I mean, you put up some new signs and maybe, a protected area and you've changed your bus route. You print some new maps.
Yeah.
Maps, put up new signs to mark where the bus routes are. It's not like changing a sewer line or water line, and we're not looking at our infrastructure in terms of that. I mean, if you look also, one thing about the bus routes, they're not equal. In between the bus routes and the areas that are zoned 6 to 12, you're taking in big swaths of northeast Olympia and east Olympia.
It's 90% of the east side neighborhood.
And
is affected
also
by
a
this.
lot of southwest here.
Right.
Northwest. But, so if you look at the maps, it is not evenly, you have this big area in southeast where it isn't affected, but yet really are kind of closer in neighborhoods. There's a disproportionate effect. It's not, I think there's an equity issue. Again, Jim said these are some of the areas that have lower income housing, more modest housing, and have a lot of diversity already.
Yeah.
Okay, so instead of taking bus routes as a criteria, you said something about using nodes, which have already been identified in the comprehensive plan. Can you show us a map of those and tell us a little more about them?
So I have a map here. Where is it? Here it is, right here. And you can see the areas in red, the one that have the hatching, those are our high density nodes. And the maroon one is downtown. So they're the Martin Pacific Lilly Triangle, downtown, and then around Capitol Mall.
Well, are they already dense, or is there just a hope that they will become dense?
Well, some of the area around Capitol Mall has a fair amount of housing. Downtown, we have a lot of construction going on right now. Unfortunately, most of it is market rate or high-end housing. And then this area, the Martin Lilly Pacific Triangle, doesn't have that much development.
But it has a lot of vacant commercial space at this point.
Right, and low, 1 story.
Right.
So the minimum density in these areas is 25 units per acre. These would be really good areas to try the missing middle in.
Can you think of benefits to concentrating missing middle housing in these areas?
Well, they're close to transportation. These are in a triangle, basically, So they're really near as you can see, the red area are our high-density corridors. So that's where we have the frequent bus service. And the way we envision them, as some of them have it already, I mean, Ralph's is up here, and we have, a supermarket over near the Capitol Mall, is that they be close to services. I mean, when we did it, we thought that we heard that people especially wanted to live in an urban environment and, be close to services like a food store, a coffee shop, a bookstore, that type of thing, and be able to live without a car if they wanted to. So living in one of these nodes would do that, and it would be good for our climate in terms of our carbon footprint.
Well, I think it gives you critical mass for generating additional bus service. You know, if you're spreading out over, you know, an ADU here and a duplex there and a triplex over here, you don't really build enough ridership to justify a new bus line. But if you start putting significant nodes where people are traveling between, then you actually build a critical mass for keeping more and more bus lines along. And then those other people who might get developed have development units in between can join into that and take advantage of it in a way that you can't right now. You're just not building it fast enough.
So all of those advantages that the proponents were hoping for from density have a better chance of taking place in one of those nodes.
That would be my thought.
The
And I think it would be cheaper to develop the units, which might also lower and quicker, which might also lower or at least cap some of your housing prices.
Right, and also we might get some bus service later at night. I think for a lot of
Right.
people who work right now, you know I go to meetings downtown and the bus service falls off, you know, after about 7 or 8 at night. So you could get, you know, bus service at off hours. The other thing that our comprehensive plan calls for is sub-area planning, where the neighborhoods, and Northeast has done that, and Jim's group is involved with doing sub-area planning and developing around neighborhood centers. So we have different neighborhood centers. There's, I forget how many.
Like
There's
13, I think.
I was going to say 12, but 13 of them. And an example of a neighborhood center is the Wildwood Center in Southeast Olympia is a neighborhood center. The West Side Food Co-op is a neighborhood center.
San Francisco Street Bakery area up in the Northeast is another one.
And so really developing some density around those and slowly going out, but in conjunction with sub-area planning for the neighborhoods.
Okay, so you're saying that the neighborhoods can themselves plan for this kind of development.
Or where it would be best in their neighborhood.
Yeah, the East Side Neighborhood Association about 1.5 years ago started on sub-area planning. And I joined that group in January when I retired. And one of the conversations we're having right now is what could be done to develop something that there's not a designated neighborhood center where we are. And one of the conversations we're having is how to pull one together in conjunction with the neighborhoods on either side of 4th and State. And what would have to be done in that regard, and then what the implications would be. But that is one of the very real conversations that we've been having in our sub-area group. So,
And with the missing middle proposal, would the neighborhood associations actually lose control over that sort of thing?
right now it's just kind of run past us. What we've typified it as is that we get left to pick up the pieces after it goes through, rather than being able to say, well, gee, maybe this type of housing might work best here and this might work better here. In our neighborhood association, we've talked about what we think are missing middle pieces that might work and where they might work in the neighborhood. But right now, because it's just being spread across the city without much input almost no input from the neighborhood association, you don't really get the chance to get involved in that kind of planning.
Yeah. Well, does any part of the city, does any part of the city administration review the plans for missing middle housing and pass on it?
Well, the way it is, it's come out of the planning department, developed this. It's before the planning commission. They will make their recommendation. Probably, I would say, sometime by the end of this month.
Yeah.
And then it will go to council. And so it will be council's decision of to modify what the recommendation is from the planning commission, or to accept it, or come up with a new proposal.
Yeah.
So so that's the way the process is outlined.
Okay. And you talked about picking up the pieces. Wouldn't that include some additional infrastructure costs?
In our neighborhood, that certainly would. We've done a fairly careful look at what types of housing structures we currently have, where our vacant lots are, all of that type of thing for our neighborhood. And one of the things we discovered in doing that is that there are areas in our neighborhood that could be filled in. Where you only have one house on an extraordinarily large lot, or you actually have open acreage, that type of thing. And part of what we're trying to figure out is, okay, why hasn't that been developed to date? And one of the things that stands out is that the infrastructure is short. Much of that land is in the south end of our neighborhood. If you think of the east side neighborhood, it's the area basically south of the water tower. And the problem is that you can't access it easily with arterials. There's some problems with the sewer and water in that area. And so those are the things that have to be fixed to get more development into that. This kind of blows past that. It proclaims you're going to get that development, but it doesn't take, I actually read some notes from a past chair of the neighborhood association who was chair like 10 years ago, when she was working on the same idea of trying to increase the infill in that area, and she ran into that same problem, which was the landowners there were telling her about problems they have with infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And I know, I mean, the easy thing that people have seen recently in our area that tells you a little bit about the weakness is that, for instance, we just recently had a pipe blowout at Boulevard right overlooking the freeway, caused a car accident on that south end of the neighborhood. They just had to replace some pipes, water pipes, down in the other corner of the south end corner of the neighborhood because they were leaking. Anytime a truck drove over them, they leaked and broke. And so they've had to go in and fix that. And that's the kind of stuff that has to get done. The Missy Middle doesn't pay for that.
Well, I don't believe they've completely decided whether they're going to charge impact fees or waive them for this new type of building. But proponents are saying that they would really like to see the impact fees reduced or eliminated because that would encourage more development.
Well, the impact fees pay for real costs. They pay for roads, they pay for schools, they pay for parks, and I believe they pay for fire. So those are costs that we incur as we increase our density. Mm-hmm. Right now, what the city is planning to do is study the different types of housing units to see if less people live in an ADU than a house, for instance, or
if they
or a duplex.
Really aren't having as much impact.
For instance, downtown right now, they did a study and they waived the impact fees for schools because there were very few families with students downtown. Yep. So they didn't think so they're going to study that type of thing. But if the impact fees aren't paid, they are, somebody has to bear the costs, and it ends up being the public, mm-hmm. because they're real costs, and it gets shifted to the property owners, the public at large.
Okay, that might be a problem. I don't know exactly how the city's finances are, but I don't think they need additional burdens. So how would you improve this missing middle proposal?
Well, I would start, first of all, I think the public has to be involved. The public really has not been, most neighborhoods don't know about the proposal or are just finding out about it. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be a better process. Again, it has to go with sub-area planning. I would think that we should, we're doing 10 housing types at once, that we should try to look at chunks, like do 2 housing types and make changes to those and see how it works, evaluate it. Maybe do pilot areas to see how it works. Did it?
Maybe use those nodes that you all were talking about.
And then, one of the things that the city has backed off because the housing is clearly going to be market rate is if affordability is important, and I think it is, to kind of build that into the proposal so that we, to have clear objectives, clear scope of work and objectives that say, you know, we will increase affordable housing by 20% in, you know, 10 years. That's that kind of objective, so that we kind of bake it in the cake.
Well, and I think an example of that is that, for instance, if you're going to give certain incentives to certain types of missing middle housing, especially to those who are non-resident owners, you might want to think about you doing those incentives for those people who put in affordable housing as a primary objective of what they're developing. I know of at least one person we ran into recently in walking the neighborhood who's trying to do exactly that and was really frustrated because, you know, he kept running into walls in terms of what he wanted to do, and yet what he was trying to do was, I think, a good thing. But, you know, so he hits walls out the city on one hand, and he was sort of mad at us because we were having problems with missing middle, and I had to walk him through what the issues were, at the end of which he said, oh yeah, right, that's exactly what I'm running into too. I'm getting applied to me things that they apply to people who are just trying to make lots of money out of this. And he said, I'm trying to do a social service. So I think that there's something to be said for trying to use the incentives for missing middle to develop actual affordable housing and not giving it to folks who are just doing market rate. I think that's also something to be said. You know, I think there's been a complaint that says, oh gee, a lot of the neighborhoods have are only developed at 4 units per acre or 5 units per acre, that type of thing. And in our neighborhood, as I know, is up over 6. I think the Northeast is over 6. Probably a large part of your neighborhood is over 6. I think in those cases, if you're going to do an infill, even with some of these housing types that they're talking about, there should be some kind of cap so that the neighborhood doesn't exceed its designated units per acre. So if you're in an R4 to 8, you should only go up to 8. You can't keep just dumping properties in there, because right now a lot of the proposals in the missing middle are developing units at 12 to 18 units an acre. 12 in an R8 to 12, R4 to 8, and 18 in an R6 to 12. So they're actually increasing the density by 50%. The proponents tell us it's not going to increase density, but nobody's proposed capping it, so it doesn't.
Yeah. We think there's a whole bunch of provisions, or at least, that will increase density above the prescribed limits. So more than 8 in a 4 to 8, or more than 12 in a 6 to 12 zone.
And there's some fairly clear-cut ones that do that.
And then there's this equity issue. If we're going to do the missing middle, there has to be some way where it's done more equitably across the neighborhoods.
It seems like if you're in the neighborhood that has 6+ units per acre, maybe a little extra focus should be going to the areas that have 4.2 units per acre in residential areas, which is not really the way this is developing so far.
Or even what you would ideally do is do a study and say, what kind of housing, you know, where do we need our housing?
Right.
And what kind of housing do we need? Do we need housing around our schools? And if so, if we were designing housing for students, what would that housing look like? You know, we haven't done the basic research of what kind of housing we need where.
Or even what our makeup is. I mean, one of my frustrations is that I ended up, for our neighborhood, doing a full-scale analysis of the parcels, the sizes, and how many units were on them, and whether they were owner residents or not. All of which you can get from the tax assessor's office. I did it all online. However, I had to do it property by property. The city could literally go to the tax assessor and get a data dump and do that same analysis, and they haven't done it.
The other thing is we have, you know, a lot of seniors in single-family houses, and at some point they will probably be moving out of those houses, and that will free up additional housing. You know.
What about the idea of the Housing Land Trust?
That's something that's actually been talked about in our Eastside Neighborhood Association. One of the members of our sub-area group has some experience and knowledge in that, and we have...
Can you explain it real briefly?
The brief discussion, I am not the expert that he is, but the brief discussion is that what would happen is that you'd have either a nonprofit, or you would have the city take over ownership of the land beneath houses to be developed. and thereby basically take that cost off the table, and then allow people to build and buy on top of that land. And that would be the part that would be what people would be mortgaging and then selling and keeping for time periods. And the idea is that it takes the land cost out from under it, and it also cuts down on the speculation.
And then you can have equity, but just in the house.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I read through email that there's a new Thurston Land Trust. And in fact, they've done an article in Works in Progress for this month. So if people are interested in that, they could read, the explanation.
Okay.
The other thing the city hasn't done is inclusionary zoning. And that is like if you build, for instance, we have for cottage houses, right now we have a 20% density bonus. So you could go, if you're in a 4 to 8 area, you could put in an extra 20% of units. They're proposing to increase that to 50%. So in a 4 to 8 area, you could actually build 12 units. But they're not saying, oh, make some of those units affordable. And that's what inclusionary zoning is.
Okay.
You have a quadruplex and one of the units has to be affordable. So they haven't done that type of thing at all in the missing middle.
So all of these proposals that you're talking about, they're just regulatory changes. They're not actual subsidies that the city is putting in.
Right.
So that it makes it somewhat less expensive for the city.
Well, and I frankly, to be real honest, because we see this in our own neighborhood, I think that the city, in taking on the missing middle, kind of took something backwards. They have in the future planning to do some regulation on Airbnbs. Airbnbs take units out of the housing stock for people to rent. And we see Airbnbs popping up all over the place in our neighborhood. Frankly, if you're doing, and the Portland study showed that there was some use of accessory dwelling units going to Airbnbs in their case. I think if you're going to develop missing middle units, one of the restrictions on them should be that you don't get to Airbnb them. Otherwise, you've undone the housing benefit you're trying to get.
Right, right. Okay, I think we've come to the end of our time, and I think we've put out a lot of very useful information. And I want to thank you both for participating. It's very, very kind of you to share your expertise, and I think people are going to get a lot of benefit out of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
And I want to thank the audience for being with us tonight.